Hello.
How are you?
Fine. How about you?
It's a beautiful spring day.
So, Peter, we did send you a few questions, and our project is to interview you, Ed Schein and Otto Scharmer upon the present situation. And we did send you the first question. How would you describe the present situation on the background of organization development, culture development, and personal development with the help of your framework, which is the learning organization and the 5 disciplines? What do you experience? What do you see? And how would you describe it?
Let me just get a little more clarity because I was curious when you asked it, at what level? I mean, you can start obviously at the societal level today. It's the natural starting point, I would say, probably for all of us, since our societies are locked into a very unusual mode of operating. But I'm not sure that would be very helpful for you.
No, I would propose that we can start with the general level, but as you might consider, we are more interested upon what's the consequences that you can describe on the level of organizations, teams, and groups,
Right.
Because society, that's always a problem for me, is a bit too abstract,
I think it's a lot less abstract today, but yes, I understand that in general. But keep in mind, all my direct experience these days is in education, because for many, many years, I've been moving more and more in that. I just got off a call just now with half a dozen people, including 2 of the more senior leaders in education in California, in the State Department of Education, and a parallel system is called the California Collaborative for Educational Excellence. So I'm happy to kind of start at that level, but just keep in mind, I really don't have anything to say firsthand in terms of really being closely connected with business organizations right now.
Okay, that's good for me.
Well, if I'll just start there, the reality of the work has changed so profoundly. Around the world, we're in this mad dash for educators everywhere learning how to go online, right? And do all their courses to students sitting in front of some sort of a gadget. Of course, that's already a huge problem because in most of the places in the world, that is a huge equity issue. Who is set up, who has a device, who has good internet service. So it's revealing what, at least in this country, I can't speak for other countries in the same depth on this particular issue. In this country is the number one issue that most educators wrestle with all the time, which is equity or inequity, which is so deeply embedded in our society, but it really shows up. One of the things when you work with kids, you get a very distinctive window under the conditions of your culture. It's much more distinct than when you work with adults, because you're basically looking at the circumstances into which children are born and raised before they've had the opportunities in their life to kind of follow their own path. So it's a very profound window in America. It's extraordinary. The first problem with the educators in New York, the first problem when they were going to start to shut down schools is 100,000 homeless children in New York City. Yeah. Okay. 100,000 homeless children who would not get food if the schools closed. So they had to immediately start to organize how to make sure the kids got their food. Yeah. So anyhow, and watching, the call I was just on is probably as good as any place to start at the more concrete level. This is a project now that's about almost 4 years in development, working with the State Department of Education and their statewide network for what's called it's out of school programs, what they call expanded learning. These are all the programs before school, after school, summertime, and they're especially important for the at-risk students because for many of them, they absolutely have to have these kind of programs in order to not be in danger and in order to have some structure in lives that are otherwise very chaotic. So that's a network we've been working with now for, as I say, about 4 years. So watching how they're dancing right now, the present circumstances is really, really interesting. Because, you know, if you go back to what I said at the beginning, everybody's racing to go online. Of course, that's true of all organizations too. And the first thing that you notice is that basically everybody is trying to do what they normally do in the ways they normally do it when everything has changed.
Yeah.
So while the artifacts of our situation, you know, our ability to work face to face, our ability to go to a place of work, our ability to have any kind of direct contact in the normal ways around our work has changed completely. The habits, the underlying ways of thinking. I mean, I was on a call last week, actually Friday, with a group of the master practitioners. These are mostly now in this call. These would be teachers and principals. So we have a global network of master practitioners in what we now call compassionate systems. And it was a principal of a primary school, very, you know, really accomplished, amazing leader. And she was in tears because her board has insisted they have to cover all the same curriculum. And her teachers are trying desperately to do this. But she's saying it just doesn't work. You know, you can't sit and look at a screen or you expect a kid to look at a screen, let alone an adult, a teacher, for 6 or 8 hours in a day and go through your normals. It's crazy. So this kind of simple interpretation, which I think is probably pretty apt for most people in most work settings around the world, everything's changed and we're trying to act like nothing's changed. The slowest to change, and of course this wouldn't be surprise any of us, the slowest to change is our internal realities, our expectations, our mental models, our assumptions, our habitual ways of doing whatever we do. So it's this wild experiment. You could call it a massive collective social experiment. How rapidly can those inner worlds start to adjust to a different external reality?
And what do you suggest? How fast can they change? And what do we need to be able to change really on the inside?
Well, I think the two questions are probably inseparable because, you know, how fast can they change is pretty abstract until you consider specifics. So let's just take a teacher. I mean, that's a good context to look at because we all know what that's like. You know, it's the upstream institution. We all went to school. So a teacher who's used to standing in front of a classroom, delivering some curriculum, you know, works in, you know, typically maybe 1 hour blocks of time. Sometimes it's 50 minutes. Maybe in some settings it's 2 hours. But you've got a certain amount of stuff you want to get through in this 1 hour. Now, if it's a standard lecture format, which is still what 90% of the teachers around the world do, they stand in front of a room and they deliver a curriculum. Then you're talking about 6, 7 of these sessions in a day, right? If you're in a secondary education. If you're in primary education, it may be a little bit different structure because you may have one group of kids for 6 or 8 or 10 hours. But in any event, you're still trying to get through your stuff. So that's where the mental model starts. You know, my success as a professional is defined by getting through a certain amount of curricular material. Because if I don't do that, my bosses will get on my case. And, you know, the tests are designed to be administered every month. And those tests will show dramatic failure if we don't get through the material. So that's the kind of mindset that we're working with in this particular situation. And again, it's an easy one to identify with. And it's, you know, so we say, well, what has to change there? Well, first off, you know, kids cannot stare at the screen for 6 or 8 hours. They can't do it. They will get bored, frustrated, angry. And by the way, I don't think adults can either. So how do you restructure it? So, you know, the kids go outside and play, assuming there's an outside they can access, just to, climb a tree or do something different, or just break and rest. Do something in their home. One of the ideas that emerged in our conversation last week with the master practitioners was, how do you help every child use this opportunity, every student, to connect with their social and ecological reality, the field nature of our existence. They don't have school anymore. They don't have, being around a bunch of other kids. That's the kind of grounding. And of course, it's full of a lot of challenges as well as a lot of fun. But that's social reality. The biggest justification for continuing school to me in an age where a lot of kids could get all the content online is the social reality. Learning to be together, learning what it means to deal with conflict, learning how to actually do a project where different students contribute in different ways to something that we're all working on together. These are the kind of the real collective or social aspects of learning. And how do you kind of try to keep those alive when you're in a totally different reality? So those are the particulars. I think the mental models around, I have to talk in front of this little green dot or whatever is my camera for 6 or 8 hours nonstop every day, those will fade because it won't happen. The teachers, in every check-in I've had with teachers, where teachers have been involved in the last month, they all use the exact same word, exhausted. They just talk about being exhausted. And so I think that mental model starts to break down because biologically we can't do it. Physically, psychologically, and physically, we just can't do it. Emotionally, physically, and psychologically, can't be done. So then you've got that mental model under great stress. So what you really need then next is also, what are some good options? And I think that's where different groups of educators will have to sort that out. But I think a lot of that could change relatively quickly because it'll have to. Now, there's other mental models. Well, what's school for? And how do you judge success? How much are you attached to your tests? That's a different question, but that's really not for the educators. That's really the parents, the ministries of education. So that's a larger social question. That probably will change a little more slowly. But again, of necessity, it's going to be driven to change in different ways. Will we eventually get to the point of defining the aims, which is kind of where this, you might say, fundamentally has to start? What are the fundamental goals or aims of education, primary education, secondary education? That's a huge and very fundamental societal question. Will we get to that point? I don't know. That obviously is the longest time delay of all, but in many ways it's the most important. So it depends on the particulars, how long it'll change. But I think some stuff will change pretty quickly because we won't have an option.
Okay. Muna, do you have any additional question? One of my next questions would be, I actually started out with the target group of educators and I moved to the business managers, and you obviously made the other movement. What has been your experience behind that? What's the motivation to do that? Do you have any assumptions guided you to do that?
Sure. I started off focusing on business just because it was easier. It was quite clear that most businesses were starting to be aware that they were in intensely competitive environments, increasingly global environments. If they didn't get better and better at innovating, they were going to die. That's an awakening that has gradually spread throughout the business world on a global scale. So that created openness and flexibility and possibilities, because I had no inherent interest in business per se, but it was just pragmatic. On the other hand, I always had in mind eventually wanting to go back and particularly work in primary and secondary education, because I've always had this simple assumption that while business is the most powerful institution in the world, that varies a little bit country by country, but I would say even in China, even in settings where the government is very, very powerful, business is still, one of, if not the most powerful institution. education is the most important. And if you define importance by time horizon, and if you start with the assumption, this has always been my guiding assumption forever, since I was a kid, that our societies will really have to change. We cannot continue living on the earth the way we live today. It simply won't happen. And we'll see one after another way that Mother Earth will push back. We're seeing one right now. The spread of pandemics is Mother Earth telling us. So there's a great meme going around, which is really brilliant. The coronavirus pandemic is Mother Earth telling us children to go back to our room and close the door.
That's great.
Because, in part, these things arise, and they've been arising with greater frequency because of the incursion of the human world on the larger wild world. These viruses that jump from an animal, or particularly not a domesticated, but a wild animal, non-domesticated animal to human animal, occurs more and more often simply because the habitat has been so reduced. And the incursion of humans on the larger natural world has been a relentless process for a couple hundred years. That makes us more vulnerable. Then, of course, you add to that the global travel and all that. So in epidemiology, they talk about risk of incidence. That something like this, there's a term, I always forget the pronunciation, nuisance. There's a particular term for the jump of a virus from an animal to a human, between species, particularly between a wild species and human, and then the risk of transmission. And we've increased both of those risks dramatically over the past 30, 50 years. But we have to remember that the plague spread way before there were aircraft travel. So obviously, once you get a kind of jump of a virus from an animal, non-domesticated animal, to a human, it's enormously dangerous because the human immune system has had no time to develop its own ways to cope. So obviously, epidemics didn't start in this last 50 years. But you might say one consequence of our crazy way of living today is increasing vulnerability. And we cover that all up with this facade. We're so smart. We're so technologically sophisticated. We are incredibly vulnerable. And all our technology is basically worthless at some point if we don't realize that our fundamental way of living in the world is what has to change. That's always been my core assumption. And from that standpoint, education is a very important institution, as is business, as is government, of course, these three core institutions.
Do you think is your aim to set the basis within this education to make sure that we are also ready as adults for our organizations? Because we're as well also vulnerable in our organizations. We don't speak about it, but there's lots of burnout cases and mental issues and stress.
Absolutely.
Problems, etc. And we don't speak about it. At least over here in Europe, still somehow a taboo.
Yeah, well, this facade we keep trying to maintain that we really got our act together. When most kids will tell you this is crazy. You do not have your act together. And the social and psychological stress is a great example. Kids are all growing up with parents that are horribly overstressed. And they're in schools that are telling them, in order to be successful, you need to be like your parents. And they're going, why? Why do I want to be like my parents? So yeah, I think that's absolutely right. The main way we've kind of tried to address that is the work today, which we call compassionate systems, has arisen from a synthesis of systems education and social emotional education. So children, it's crazy that kids should go to school where they're all competing as individuals and they're not learning how to work together. They're not learning how to deal with conflict. They're not learning, they're not building solid social competencies because those are going to be crucial to be successful professionals. But then again, the larger system is so out of whack. A business system that exists to exploit nature and has been phenomenally successful over a couple of centuries at destroying the natural world when in fact we are the natural world. So yes, we would like children to leave education understanding both of these and having a much deeper sense of confidence that they can be part of the long-term changes. So you can think about short medium and long term. Short is, just my own career, my own work. Medium is how I help shape organizations that are more socially um, sophisticated, not just technically sophisticated, but you could characterize all of our work. We're trying to build organizations that are socially sophisticated also. But then the larger still, as always, and how do those businesses become part of industries that are restoring the earth rather than destroying the earth, that are creating less and less vulnerability for the human species rather than more and more vulnerability. So all three levels are important, and all three define education. We always say there's the three fundamental levels of systemness. This system, mind, body, heart system, this system, the social reality of friends, relationships, teams, and then, of course, all the larger systems. We aspire that children should have an education that makes them, gives them understanding and capability at all three of these levels.
What about the adults that are in their current organizations and maybe didn't have this education but had the old system? Like, let's say people about around 40, 50 years old, what do you think? What do they need? Because those are the most often, those are the victims of like those mental illnesses or burnouts, etc. What do you think? What do we have to do for them? What do they need?
Well, I think, if you think of burnout as a disease, not just a bit of bad luck, because it's not first question I've always thought on this subject is, how is burnout different than being tired? If you work too hard, you're tired. You rest, you go on vacation, you do whatever you need to do to help yourself get over being tired. Obviously, burnout is much more than just being tired. It's a psychological state. In my experience, this is now just my personal opinion. I don't think it'd be very hard to say anything like this clinically. My personal conviction is that burnout is primarily a consequence of fatalism. I think fatalism is a deep cultural dis-ease in the sense of imbalance. We know our lives are a mess, and we don't believe we can do anything about it. That's fatalism.
Okay, yeah, that's true.
And I think that's an attitude that's so pervasive in modern society. But because it's so pervasive, we don't see it. Everybody feels that way. It's like stress, right? Somebody's going to point out, oh, yeah, you're stressed, but so are most all the people around you. That's why kids are so good, because they're not quite yet part of this adult world. They're being slowly drawn into it. But I think fatalism at the personal level and the organizational level, that the organization is the way it is, it can't change, and the societal level, we're screwed. As the kids will tell you, if you get in real dialogue with kids around the world, I've not seen an exception to this in 30 years. Real dialogue where the kids can just talk and the adults don't interfere. I guarantee you, two subjects that will always come up are climate change and poverty. I will guarantee you, always come up. Because the children are acutely aware of these profound social and ecological imbalances of the larger world, and it's their future. So before they've become fatalistic, they're just really concerned. And then gradually we teach them that nothing can be done about it, because this is what success looks like.
If you look at the way how society, or you described the three systems like education, business, and I think
government, public sector.
How are we trying to solve? Is there any kind of good cooperation that you can observe now, or is it like a competition between the three? Like the government is taking over, or is the business world bringing solutions, or how would you describe that in the way?
Well, obviously for much of my career, the past 25 years, tried to focus on businesses that were really trying to contribute in this way. That's kind of the vast majority of my experience. We started a sustainability consortium amongst a group of businesses in 1999 to 2001. And then the Sustainable Food Lab developed out of that in 2002, 2003. And of course, Otto has built many networks of businesses in finance and banking and other sectors. So I think there's no shortage of examples of businesses who are really trying to kind of be positive leaders in shaping a different reality. And I think in many cases, their efforts are cross-sectoral. In other words, many of the projects we've been involved with have been really the collaboration of businesses and civil society, particularly, and to some degree where there's real openness, government. I think Otto would probably agree. I don't know if his assessment has changed in the last couple of years, but probably agree that if you look at those three sectors, business, civil society, and the public sector or government, that we've been somewhat successful at building networks of collaboration that have been impactful between business and civil society, but relatively less so with government. There are good examples, but there aren't that many, and particularly in the West. So that said, I still think that the blind spot is children and the next generation. So I think you still, whatever you do there, you have to say, yeah, and what's that going to look like in another 30 years? Do you have to keep restarting and restarting and restarting? Or are you going upstream and building this kind of ability to work together across boundaries into the core of your whole education process? So, yeah, I think there's plenty of success stories. I'm not as closely involved as I was. I now more have secondhand involvement. And, you know, I know all the people in the food lab, and I stay pretty much in touch with that. And I know a lot of Otto's initiatives. But again, I'm more of an observer than I am a participant, as I would have been, 10 years ago.
If we go into some of the last questions, my question would be if you see the situation now as a crisis, and we describe crisis as something which is not negative, but is the kind of a turning point, would you describe it as is it falling down of an old system and the coming up of a new, is it like a paradigm shift that we are observing? And I mean, you described with the example of schools, the normal way of reacting is going back to the old routines. That doesn't work anymore. So we are in a state of openness now, or how would you describe it?
Well, I think that's a question we're all asking. I mean, one form of the question is, whenever the immediate urgency of this time starts to recede a bit, when we're sort of back to normal, let's say it's 6 months now, I don't know, but it's probably not 25 years from now. Maybe many people say, well, we'll never go back to normal, but that's another way to say the question. What'll happen? I do think one of the most important time periods is going to be the 1 year or so after we ease some of this social distancing. Will we just go as quickly as possible back to the way we always just do things, or will we have the experience that will lead us to some new things? I mean, there is a very ironic but powerful metaphor of everybody separating themselves, doing it all together. Right?
Yeah, that's true.
Isn't that interesting?
That's true.
That's what's going on in the world right now. So in a way, we have more access to empathy and real compassion for each other than ever before, even though we're physically more distant. So the way I often think about it is that our technology has created a kind of facade of connectedness, but at a deeper level, culturally, we've probably become more and more distrustful, less and less connected in human terms. But now maybe that's all reversing.
Yeah, I see in that sense, I see the approach, your approach, and also the approach of Otto and at Shine, especially the humility, the spirit of inquiry, that's, and as you describe it, that's really one of the paradox situations that now that we are disconnected or separated, it creates a kind of a togetherness, which is amazing.
It is amazing.
All over the different cultures,
Right.
the different ideologies, that's an experience that is very special. And I agree, we have to kind of take the chance of reflecting upon that, not going back to the old routines, that's one of the dangers.
Yeah, I think that's
Muna?
a big question.
Muna?
No, I'm fine with that. Go ahead. Go on. I think this is the main issue that we have here, or that I'm thinking about. So what's going to happen afterwards? So as soon as we come back,
Right.
how fast are we going to jump into our routine again? Like, we just forget everything because we'll have to catch up lots of things. We'll have to catch up social aspects, everything. And then humans tend to forget very quickly. So
yeah, it's the part of the crisis dynamic, right? You so much of your adrenaline system is mobilized, so much fear is mobilized, so much urgency is mobilized, but you can't live like that. You have to kind of drift back to something that's more sustainable. On the other hand, maybe there's some experiences. I mean, I think, to me, the simple kind of perspective on this is those who were already seeking that will find deepening.
Yeah,
Those who were not looking for it at all, just wanted to will not find much. I don't think these sort of crisis moments transform people so much as they temper or deepen people. Those of us who have always been interested, and there's a lot of us, sense that something has to change, can see, oh, well, we kind of got through this and we helped each other. We'll focus on the things that indicate the kind of reality we hope will come, but a lot will not. So again, big change never occurs in unison. It occurs when there gets to be certain critical masses. Will there be more of a critical mass who can say, well, look at all the ways we started to help each other? The Chinese, apparently, one of the reasons they were so able to contain the virus, beside the fact that they can organize and do things centrally. That's the story in the West. Well, the government's strong, the government imposes it. They used a lot of traditional Chinese medicine. What traditional Chinese medicine focuses on, and they did this very systematically with government controlling it, strengthening the immune system. So they targeted the people who were infected but hadn't yet gotten really serious symptoms. So they were all in hospitals, right? They had built these hospitals in Wuhan, already infected but had not gotten so serious that they needed urgent medical attention. And they did Tai Chi, they did drugs, traditional Chinese herbs, all the traditional diagnostic and intervention methods. And there's going to be a lot of evidence that was one of the reasons they didn't get more really serious infections and illness, and they could gradually contain it. Well, that's a beautiful story. We all know the Western medical system is very powerful, but very limited. It doesn't really deal. It doesn't really deal with health and well-being. And this simple kind of difference in strategy, how do we kind of save somebody or hope and pray that they won't infect somebody else, versus how do we proactively strengthen the immune system? Western medicine does not really know how to do this. But globally, collectively, we have that knowledge. Now, maybe that knowledge can spread a little more widely.
Yeah, that's true.
What about strengthening the mental system? So this.
Well, you can extend that to say for societies. What is the analogy of the societal immune system? Trust, sense of mutuality, friendliness, all these kind of ancient things that have always characterized healthy societies. Some sense of common purpose. I would say caring for the children, one of the things that can all connect us to really feel like we have an active role in the life of children. It's one of the most universal ways that societies build a sense of connectedness. These, to me, are pretty good analogies for the societal immune system. And as they fall down, guess what? You become vulnerable. So I would say all the epidemic of stress and anxiety, one way to think about it is a failure of the societal immune system to create the conditions that would otherwise help that. I heard a very poignant story about 6 months ago from a native person in northern Canada. And she said, when our people can no longer hunt, because for all kinds of regulations, they can't hunt as much as they used to. And, it's a lot of it is misplaced, well-intended efforts, because the amount of hunting that the native did relative to species extinction was very trivial. But here was the story. The story, she said, was what we found amongst our young men that suicide rates went up dramatically when they could no longer hunt. I'll just finish my story. It's not much more to it. It's very simple. So what she said is that what we find is that the suicide rates increase dramatically with our young men when they can no longer hunt. Why is that? She said, well, suicide at some level is usually a spontaneous action. You know, there's conditions that developed and you're getting more and more depressed, but the action is spontaneous. She said, what our young people, our young men particularly learn in hunting is patience. Because to hunt, you mainly just sit and you wait and you wait. She said, so they learn how to deal with the rises and falls of their emotions. And when they no longer have this kind of training to deal with the rises and falls of their emotions, they become vulnerable to when all of a sudden their emotions get low. It was quite a lovely story. And it's a good example of maybe for all of us, you know, yeah, of course emotions go up and down. Who doesn't get stressed? Who doesn't get, you know, pessimistic? Who doesn't get, you know, a suicidal in their thoughts? The question is not whether that happens. The question is what happens when that happens. Right. And do we have the capacity to kind of allow the rises and falls of our emotions without taking action based on those emotions? It's a good way to think about societal resilience, creating the conditions for people to deal with the natural rise and fall of emotions. As opposed to, well, you should never feel this way. Oh, and by the way, you just take something to make it go away until after a while, you realize after a while that it won't ever go away. It just keeps coming back. I think that's the kind of naive notion, right? That we should be able to make it go away through kind of medicating ourselves, whether it's Netflix or a drug. But to make it go away rather than to allow it to be present, and then it goes away on its own.
But this needs time, don't you agree? I mean,
it needs capacity building. It needs time to build the capacity.
Yes.
Which is what you might say civilization in its finer qualities does. It's a very complex, multifaceted, individual and collective capacity building process. Learning how to be human. Learning how to be human as an individual, learning how to be human connected to others. As those capacity building processes disappear or are atrophied, then these fundamental abilities don't develop.
Okay. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
A last image that I recently read about this crisis is that it was described as the grievance process, you know, in terms of Kübler-Ross, that we are leaving an old image or an old world. And one phase that in her approach has been missing, the last one, which she never talked about, this meaning, you know, and that's actually, we are moving into a new world now, and in terms of taking the time, what's the meaning of all of this? What meaning do we make of this situation?
Right.
And then we can, and I see ourselves as kind of helpers to translate. And your story goes very well into this type of ritualistic description of a passage, you know, a passage from one state of consciousness to the next one. And yeah, I just hope that we will all use this crisis as a good chance, you know. And that's also the background of our 3 interviews. We will ask the similar questions to Ed and Peter, and also to Otto. And then we will find out how we can put it together, you know.
Good.
And we will feedback it to you.
Good. Well, good luck. Say hi to the other guys, and thanks for taking the time.
Thanks a lot, Peter.
Thanks a lot, yeah, Peter.
Bye.
You're welcome.
Bye.
Thanks a lot.
Yes. Be well.
Bye-bye. You too. Bye.
Hi.
Hello again.
Hello again.
Hi. How are you doing?
Fine, fine, thank you. How are you guys?
Good, good, thanks.
This time, I would like to do the short introduction because we have a new colleague here. His name is Daniel Schmid, and you might know him. He's one of the co-editors of the Spirit of Inquiry books, and his article is really in there is fascinating about the family history of the Schein family, you know.
Oh,
So that's the background.
Hello, Peter. Nice to meet you.
And in the last interview, we were not yet aware of the manifesto. So today we would like to just do a short after interview. And the first questions would be your answers last time were concentrated on education. What would be your current description from the business perspective? And then the second question would be what is your state of the discussion with your manifesto with Ed, Jean
Yeah.
Bartonek, and yourself? So that would be the content of today.
Why don't we do that first? Just talk about that for a few minutes.
Okay.
I wanted to check just one thing, if there's any emails from Ed this morning. I don't think there is. I already checked Jean. Jean sent me a note earlier. But as far as I can tell, no, there isn't. I mean, Ed's very comfortable with people just kind of going off and just see what emerges. I think that's kind of his style that he's pretty comfortable with in general. And have you seen a sample of the emails that have been going back and forth over the last 4 or 5 days?
No.
Between the both of you?
Pardon?
Between the both of you? Between you and Ed, or what do you mean?
Well, so the history in a nutshell is that Ed wrote this note to Jean, and I think it was probably, and he wrote that manifesto thing. I mean, you guys ended up talking about it coincidentally, very close to the time I think he wrote it. And then he sent it to Jean and maybe a couple others. But then Jean forwarded to about 10 people. And she checked it with Ed, and Ed was fine about it. And these are all folks that Jean knows. But Jean's been a really well-known person in the OD, organization studies world, for a long time, and kind of in the mainstream in the sense of Academy of Management and all that kind of stuff. So pretty quickly, I'm looking back at the history. By April 15th, which is just early last week, they had an email thread going with about 12, 13 people. And you'd recognize most of the people, or certainly a lot of them in this. And so there's a lot of things that have gone back and forth, and it's been interesting. I mean, I think it's kind of what you'd expect, in the sense that the first wave just elicits a lot of responses. The responses elicit responses. Some people are kind of a little more theoretical in terms of talking about models, and many are telling wonderful stories and some quite beautiful things. But basically, it's a group of people, probably, I'm sure nobody knows everybody well. Jean probably knows most of them. I know probably, just glancing at the list here, probably about half of them well. So that went on for about a week or so. And it's quite interesting. I've read, I think most of the emails have gone back and forth. And I'm just realizing now that I'm talking to you and looking at this, there's actually a few I still haven't looked at. It's ones I'm just seeing for the first time now. So anyhow, that was kind of, you might say, wave one, is just getting 15 or so very interesting, well-known, mostly pretty senior organization studies people talking to each other. all sparked by Ed's manifesto. And in a way, you know, saying, hey, come on, you know, this is a big warm-up we're going through now for a lot of disruptions that are coming. And you of course, know the manifesto. We social scientists should have something useful to contribute. So I think in one of the exchanges in the last 3 or 4 days, I think it was, and there's been a couple, as you might imagine, there's kind of a core of this 15 people who are copying everybody. And then you get little side conversations. So Ed was talking, of course, in his manifesto about doing a Davos-like gathering. So I wrote a separate note to him and just copied Gene, because in it I included a lot of names of people that I said, well, if I was going to do this, I might invite this person, but not this person. It's not the sort of thing I wanted to have widely circulated. So I don't know where any of it is at right now, because I think the nature of the process is very, by the way it's structured, a kind of a divergent or diverging process. It's been very interesting and a lot of good stuff. And as I say, if you looked at the list of all the people included, you'd probably know most, if not all of them. And most have chimed in. There's probably about, I'm just glancing, I don't think I've seen anything from Otto. I'm a little surprised. It could be I missed it. But, you know, Amy, Otto, Gene, you know, a lot of people you would know. And probably 2/3 of them have contributed either a short little note or in some cases quite longer ones. But it's made for very interesting things. And Ed's quite happy with that. He said in a note just a couple of days ago, he said, you know, I'm just delighted to be able to sit. He said, it doesn't cost anything to sit and listen and read these very, very thoughtful comments from people that I respect a lot. I don't know where he's at in terms of any kind of, you know, what's next. I sent him a note last night and saying we would talk today. And do you have any particular things you'd like us to explore? You know, any guidance? And that was what I looked for a minute ago. I haven't seen any response from him to the note I wrote last night. But I didn't expect so either, because he did say a couple of days ago in one of the emails, he said, well, I kind of like this. I don't think we need to try to organize it. I don't think we need to try to be overly worried about, you know, copying different people. He said, I think you should just copy whoever you want to copy and let the get be a big kind of conversation. And he talked a little bit about self-emergence and how he's learned a lot about that over the years. In any event, so kind of that's where we're at. I don't think there's any particular plan. Gene, I don't know if anybody's doing anything on this Davos idea. Now, it could very well be that somebody is already off starting to plan or organize something for that. Ed, I don't think is. And I think he got a lot of comments on it. And I think he wasn't sure at all ever if he really wanted to do that. He just thought it was a good idea, and he'd put it out there and see who might pick it up and run with it. So I'm afraid I don't have anything very definite to say, but of course it's the character of this thing. It's only like, you know, 9 days old that this big, you know, collective conversation has been unfolding.
Okay, so because our original plan was, you know, that we just interview the 4 of you. Actually, in the beginning was just the 3 of you, 3 male, and then we added Amy, and just 2 individual interviews, you as representatives of Pioneers of Change, and then try to add it up and focus, you know, in terms of, you describe now a more divergent process. Our goal is a little bit more to bring it together and then to address it to the outside world, and we have certain target groups, and to start a dialogue, you know, and from the interview we also had this impression that it was a good idea and a good manifesto from Ed's part, and we could use it to try to start a focused dialogue process. You know, that's where we are at. Maybe the 2 of you could, like Dani, you could add, you know, where we are and what is our goal with this collection of interviews.
Sure.
Yeah, yes, because we'd like to set up a little process of an hourglass. We focus on what could social scientists bring into the actual discussion. And Ed's aim was to bring it to Davos, to the WEF. I know the CEO of the WEF. I could contact him and then ask him whether they would be ready to do a dialogue. Maybe I've seen that they did it last week on LinkedIn with the World Health Organization, an online conference which was very highly attended by many participants. Something like that. So to just to focus and then to spread again to the world. So because that's our aim to bring you four together and with one statement, and then we can spread the manifesto with all the others as well. But we need some anchor people.
And the four of you are just you would be well-known representatives of change, of pioneers of change of the OD world, and each of you has a different type of framework to look at the world and tools, whatever. And our aim in doing this interview would to actually concretize that, the four different perspectives onto the same topic, and then synergize it. That's our goal. So, and obviously with the academy, it seems to be more the process of collecting reactions and adding to a divergent discussion. So that was our question. How you describe the situation with your group, and, and we would focus more on like 4 or 5 different key learnings from the four of you, and then bring it out to the world, because what I experience now, and maybe you could react on that, at least in Switzerland, we had now all these medical experts, and all the politicians had to rely on their expertise. And now, as we start to have the idea of liberating the lockdown, we need other groups like social scientists or OD people, because we are the experts of how to organize such a change process within teams, organizations, and society. That's actually our goal for the whole thing.
What do you think about Ed's? I mean, and this has in many ways been the kind of anchor point for this email conversation of the last 10 days. Ed's really wanted to kind of focus or really emphasize climate change, which is a little different than how we kind of come out of the lockdown.
Yeah, from what I remember from the interview, Ed just said that the virus is just a first wake-up call, and then it gives us an idea about what might follow. And he took the climate change as the even bigger type of crisis that is actually showing up, in the background. And so this is like it's like an exercise how to get ready for how to deal with crisis, and because even bigger ones will come. And so we addressed the four of you as experts for teams, systems, organizations. What is your description of what happened, and how could we sort it out and approach it? That is the basic goal behind it.
And I think Ed had like the focus on bringing people together. So like climate change is something that concerns us all. So which is all over the world. We're concerned. We're touched by these by this climate change. So coronavirus is just one little part. But then finally he said, like the ocean, pollution of the ocean, everybody is like somehow is close to the ocean, so everybody knows what you're talking about, and it's all about creating a common ground where we can install changes in a way that we have the experts, the medical experts, like the OT experts, then the business experts, and just try to find something in common, like Daniel said, like this focus where we can say that's where we can actually concentrate on, and then again just let it grow somehow naturally and organically, and just and our role would be to help with our knowledge, initiate initiatives whatsoever, or whatever might happen. So and not on a lower level, but rather on a worldwide level, where we can really reach people who are in charge, who have the money, who have the voices and the influence that we maybe don't have here. So this was basically one of our aims we had.
And Peter, something that you pointed out is that the knowledge and the expertise is fragmented all over the different professional groups, you know. And what we see now that we have to, that's also one of the problems of the politicians. They have to bring this knowledge together, and based on that, they have to do tough decisions, you know. And that's what we are experiencing now. And what Ed pointed out for me as the main thing is that the world is actually steered by competition, but what we have to do now is to create containers or foundations for co-creation and cooperation. And that's actually the point where we are at, you know. And in terms of the virus, because it's all over the world at around the same time, we are all in the boat, you know, so there is no way out. And I mean, the climate change is the next step, and the oceans that would be even a further step, because the oceans are connecting all of us, you know. So that's actually the starting point of how to describe what is happening in terms of the crisis.
Yeah. Go ahead, Daniel.
Oh, thank you, Peter. In terms of Ed, it's for me, the coronavirus is like an assumption and a test, a prelude of whether we are ready to collaborate in terms of a global collaboration. Are we ready? What is the stage we're in at, we're facing at? Are we fighting together against each other, or are we on this point that we can start to really collaborate together in terms of organizing masks, fighting all these diseases in different ways? What we have democratic approaches, we have more other approaches in other countries. So that would be the point we want to start at.
Yeah. Well, you know, you've got so many, you know, basic questions about how to frame the questions. You know, what are we trying to do here? I do think the collaboration and competition is a good one, because I think it's a pretty universally needed thing. You could say that, you know, our dominant cultures have drifted a long way towards a particular model of competition. By the way, I pointed this out to Ed when we first started talking about this. And, you know, competition does not mean win-lose competition. That's a particular type of competition, you know, in all kinds of athletic areas. And you could say the same in the performing arts. People train together who then compete against each other. And they have no problem with that. You see that over and over again. And it was years ago, somebody pointed out to me that the very root etymology of the word compete is Latin competere, which means striving together. So the comb part, we forget. Yes. And we've gotten into this model of win-lose competition. If you win, I lose. And it's a very narrow model. So I do think that's a legitimate transcendent issue, because we're not going to make much headway with any of the really big issues if we don't get better at working together. I think we just have to always be careful. Language is tricky. It's very easy, particularly for the Western mind, to slip into a dichotomous framing. Collaboration, yes. Competition, no. I think that heads us in the wrong direction, because there is really very healthy competition, and then there's very unhealthy competition. And I think that it's not about competition or collaboration. It's about both. And healthy competition has a lot of collaboration in it. But nonetheless, I still think that's a good frame. That's obviously a kind of a process or strategy, not substantive, frame. Then you've got the substantive frames, climate change, the health of the oceans, how we deal with these big, giant systemic breakdowns and disruptions that are coming. So I think, as I said, there's a lot of choices you have in how you go about framing what this undertaking is about, and obviously what you want to accomplish. I mean, Ed started off with collaboration and climate change, as you might say, the two big ideas in his initial rant. And of course, the fact that the present global situation is a kind of a rehearsal, right? And that's not a new idea. It's just that now it's a salient idea. I mean, people have been talking for years. I mean, I've certainly felt for a very long time that this decade will be a decade of great disruptions. I mean, many, many people have talked about this. And now all of a sudden, it's not just an intellectual idea. It's a very real idea. And, the degree of disruption here is actually quite minor. I mean, we have to stay in our homes. For most of us privileged people, it's like, it's no big deal. Obviously, there are a lot of people who can't stay in their homes. And that's why on this particular virus, so many of us have been concerned for so long about what will happen in India and Africa, places where the density of population is so different. And the idea of going to your home office and working is not an idea. It's not meaningful for most people. But that said, still, it's a kind of a technical problem in a way. I mean, that would be a slightly different way to frame this, but that's why the medical science is so important, right? Because there's kind of a technical problem here. We don't really understand this virus. It's new to our species. What would a vaccine look like? And then you've got all the basic dynamics of epidemiology, which are basically technical at one level. You got a big stock of uninfected people, you got a stock of infected people, and you've got dynamics of interaction between them. And it gets social because when you're asking people to change behaviors, then obviously you've got a complex political social dynamic that's unleashed. But you might say the underlying problem is a technical problem. I personally do not. I always have a little worry about framing things around climate change. I think ocean health is a little better, but still they can come off as basically technical problems also. I mean, climate change is accumulating a lot of gases in the atmosphere in concentration levels that have not been there for at least, 500,000 years. That's technically what it is. And so it's all about, our energy system and the types of emissions that come out of it, many of which, of course, affect the oceans. So that's why climate change and oceans are very closely connected, because the acidification of the oceans is one of the big issues in the world. In many ways, it might turn out to be even more significant consequence of climate change than destabilizing the weather for terrestrial systems. Of course, we're a terrestrial system. We live on land, not water, so naturally we think about that. But the oceans are so crucial to food chains of so many species. And they're so crucial for all the Earth systems. That's why I think Ed was very persuaded by this friend who started to point out to him that the health of the oceans is a really big issue. But that said, still, it can be seen as a fundamentally technical problem. In other words, we're dissolving a lot of carbonic acid and acidifying the oceans. That's a technical problem. To me, the problem that sits behind all these is human beings do not have a way of living on the planet.
So what would what would actually then be the question? What is the role of us as experts, social scientists, experts of behavior change or personal change, system change? What would be?
Well, I think
how
one
could we-
point of
could
connection
we
with,
help?
with a lot of our common experience is that when we're talking about, let's just call them complex social changes, which at one level always have to do with shared assumptions, habits, and artifacts. I mean, artifacts in the most generic sense, you know, how or businesses are structured, what people measure, all the more tangible aspects of a social system. And then all the intangible aspects, the assumptions, the habits, the ways, you know, what we expect the future to look like, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's territory that's familiar to us because any deep change in a social system always has these tangible aspects and all these intangibles. So in that sense, I think there's a lot that a lot of us have learned from complex social systems change that's relevant in all of this stuff. And to me, the danger, and I'm not arguing against it, but the danger of focusing on climate change or the danger of focusing on the health of the oceans is that we end up getting caught up in all the technical aspects.
Mm-hmm.
You know, how do we change our energy system? Well, of course we need to change our energy system. However, we could have started this 50 years ago, 70 years ago. You know, there was a project done in Detroit. It was a challenge grant during the Clinton administration. And the big three auto companies were challenged to build a car on an assembly line that could get 75 miles per gallon or more. So it would be 3 times or more, at that time about 5 times the energy efficiency of the standard car. And to show they could do it technically. And they did it. They had a lot of money, you know, being dangled in front of them. But of course, nobody brought it to market. No one even thought about bringing it to market because it didn't fit their business model. It didn't fit the partnership between the oil companies and the auto companies and the kind of way they think together about things. You know, do you really want a car that takes only 1/5 as much petrol? I mean, so these are the deeper social issues, right? So I think that's obviously a point that that we all could contribute to. What have we learned about these complex, we often call them structural, you know, but that's a tricky word because it means something from a systemic standpoint, complex social systemic change processes, which are both tangible and intangible. And so that's why I always start off by saying, well, climate change is just a symptom. The destruction of the oceans is just a symptom. They're both symptoms. And what are they symptoms of? Well, they're symptoms of we humans do not know how to live.
And how can we learn that?
Well, first off, we have to recognize that that's the problem. You know, that's why I always worry about getting caught up in the technical aspects of climate change or the technical aspects of ocean health. These are absolutely valid, but it's a good way of saying, well, you know, the engineers will fix it. Or, you know, the healthcare experts will tell us what to do. Well, but where the real deeper question is, how the hell do we live? And, you know, to me, I would always start off, this is just now my own bias on this, with a little different question. Are there counterexamples of human beings knowing how to live? And what I mean by knowing how to live is very simple. How does a social system work in a way that creates harmony with the larger natural systems? Because if it doesn't create harmony, it doesn't live in a positive synergy with the larger natural systems, sooner or later, you'll get pandemics, you'll get ocean acidification, you'll get climate, you get all that stuff, because these are the larger natural systems responding to our growth. You know, we wouldn't have a pandemic right now if we didn't have the loss of habitat. I mean, basically this, I always get the biological name called zoonosis or something, but it's basically when a virus jumps from wild animals to humans, which has happened many times in human history. It's not new. It's a natural process. The problem is now it's much more likely. It's much more likely because of the expansion of the human footprint in the world and the contraction of the room for wildlife. This is why people like Ed Wilson say, you know, the starting point is we should set aside at least one half of the world with no development whatsoever, because these species have to have enough habitat. So anyhow, to me, these are all consequences, and we don't think about those things. We have no concept in the present culture, in the mainstream, of we're part of a larger natural world. And we either live in harmony, mindful of that, or we won't live. I mean, it's not a new idea. Most human societies have not lasted very long. Conversely, and this is why I say, for me, I would always start off with saying, well, who's done a better job of this? Well, the Blackfoot Indians are 15,000 years old. The genetic evidence confirms what they've said in their cultural teachings for a long time. The Aborigines have been more or less coherent, obviously not so much today, but for more like 40 to 50,000 years. These are kind of stories told within those cultures, which are now consistent with genetic evidence. So we have examples in the world of societies that have learned how to live in harmony with their larger natural environment. Do we pay any attention? Or do we think, oh, those are all so primitive, you know, they're nothing like us, they don't have iPhones, and so on and so forth. So that, to me, would be the beginnings of a kind of cultural reflection. And again, that's my own bias. I think you can't go very far without starting to realize that we're really incredibly confused. As a culture, we are incredibly confused. We do not acknowledge that we're part of the larger natural world. We do not acknowledge that we are not in control. The larger living system of life on planet is in control, and that we either play by the rules or we won't play at all. We don't get to set all the rules. None of us knows how to do photosynthesis. Without photosynthesis, there's none of the species that most of us think of on the planet, because we all depend on, so many of us depend on oxygen. No photosynthesis, no oxygen. You know what? For all of our cleverness, we cannot create photosynthesis. We don't know how it really works. We couldn't manufacture it if we had to. So we think we're so smart, but we're not very smart at all on matters that really matter, which is what allows us to live in harmony with the larger natural world. So this arrogance. So I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I mean, but I'm just saying that I was basically trying to keep anchored on was, you know, you have a lot of choices as to how you frame this whole dialogue. And while I do like climate change, ocean health, I also think however it gets framed, and I do like collaboration versus win-lose competition. You know, how do we kind of work together on truly big, complex issues? I just think all of this sits within a deeper, in my mind, kind of cultural reflection. And sooner or later, there's many paths. You have to kind of get to that. You know, when I want to get some understanding in the way you're asking now, Daniel, I find, you know, very old things to read. You know, right now I'm reading a book I've had for years, but I haven't looked at it really much in years, by a famous Lakota, a Sioux Indian elder named Black Elk. Mm-hmm. And similarly, when I read these things, I go, oh, well, this really makes sense. I mean, I do think a lot of the native cultures, not all of them, and many of them did not, but some really had developed sophisticated, you know, worldviews. That, you know, it's not about going back in time. Obviously, their populations were small. They lived in a totally different context, but there's guidance there. And we should, you know, really pay attention to the kind of, you might say, the overarching principles.
And how would you say does this paying attention then translate into our new behavior on a global scale? I mean, what do you think? What does have to happen? Because we hear people speak about these things, like, but then what they're doing or what we're seeing is not really congruent. So how can we just? What do you think? What is it exactly? What we need as a, like, some general direction of changing behaviors, thinkings, thoughts, whatever?
Well, first off, there won't be an answer. That's the first thing we have to accept. These are not technical problems that have technical solutions. There will be no, the answer is. But I do think there are some overarching ideas that need to become bedrocks of society over the next 2 or 3 generations. I mean, it's not going to happen quickly. Cultures do not change quickly. This takes multiple generations. And so, first question is, how do we kind of stay in a general direction and know that it won't happen overnight? And in the meantime, what has to happen? That's where, again, the pandemic is a good lesson, because there's a lot of things we're going to have to be able to do in the short term. But in the medium term, let's say 5-10 year time frame, but the big changes will be this century. They're going to take 2 to 3 generations, because you're talking about deep changes in awareness. Behavior ultimately is a product of awareness, right? And these are profound shifts in our awareness. We do not see ourselves as part of the larger natural world. How many of us could survive if left on our own in the wilderness? For most of human history, most people could. In this day and age, almost nobody could. We're so divorced. So, but these things, again, it won't change overnight. I think we could, in the medium term, kind of come to some consensus about a few transcendent ideas. And if you look around the world, you'll see these happening, or you'll see people working on this. Circular economy is an idea that many, many people are familiar with now. In nature, from a material standpoint, there's no waste. Everything from a material standpoint that's generated or used by one species and is a waste or byproduct that they don't want anymore becomes nutrition for another species. Everything materially moves in cycles. Secondly, energy, which is a necessity for all species, comes from the energy flux, solar in particular. But actually there are some species who live off tidal currents from the moon and so on. But basically it's the ongoing flux of energy into the planet Earth, not our capital stock. No species in the world, as far as any of us know, digs deep holes in the ground and burns former living things, what we call fossil fuels. So that's the principle. Energy is necessary for all living systems. Where does energy come from? Well, it has to come in a way that is part of the solar flux. Another principle that some people think about energy is that nature's energy systems are mostly local. Certainly the food systems are local. You don't transport food, for thousands of kilometers or miles for any other species but ours, except things that maybe blow on the wind for a long distance. So all these are examples of looking for guiding principles from mimicking nature. And that idea also is clearly out there. Biomimicry is not a radical idea anymore. Many, many people think about it. There's a whole field of, quote, green chemistry, which is a legitimate branch of academic chemistry, which is basically saying the chemistry we need for the future has to be the chemistry of living systems. So I think you could look around the world and say, well, if we needed guiding ideas, what are they? And I think as you identify them, you could find plenty of things happening in the world already that are moving in that direction. So then it becomes a matter of recognizing them, acknowledging them, supporting them, and looking at all the things that are impeding progress. I mean, these are examples to me of the strategic cornerstones for the short term, for the medium term. Let's just say the medium term is beyond a year or two and out to maybe 20 years. And then there's the really long term, the cultural change. So, I mean, you really have to, and this is, of course, a natural principle for systems, you have to embrace multiple time horizons. And you have to develop approaches that take account of the short term, medium term, and long term. But in some ways, the most important is the long term. Because that's always your best effort to answer the question, where do we want to be? where do we think would characterize healthy human societies in the next, 3 generations from now? So and then you work on the others. So I don't think I think there's a lot of wonderful things happening in the world. The problem is right now they're so swamped by all the urgent crises.
And how do we orchestrate these 3 terms you've mentioned? Are we aware of the rhythm who is thriving us, or how can we get a better sense for pattern recognition? Because now we are moved and we're not ahead of the process. What would you recommend?
Well, that's why I was saying it the way I did. I think it starts with getting anchored on the long term. So I would say first principle from the long term, we are just one more species. This species, like every other species, has to find a way to live in harmony with its niche. That's the kind of first rule of biological viability. A species is viable if it lives in harmony with its niche. Now, the niche and the species are dynamically connected. In this case, this species seems to want to live in the niche called planet Earth. I mean, you look at most of human history, our geographical niche was smaller. The various native tribes we might point to as examples of cultures that have lasted for tens of thousands of years didn't live in the world as a whole. They lived in certain geographies, and they developed philosophies and ways of living and material needs and energy systems compatible with Australia or the forests of North America or whatever. But at least right now, given our size and our aspirations, we seem to think our niche is planet Earth, which means we have to learn how to live in harmony with planet Earth. So that's like first principle. And then you kind of go from there. And that's, you could say that's the principle of biomimicry or whatever. And then, as I say, if you look for, natural energy systems, circular economy, material systems, and so on, you'll find wonderful work going on all around the world. In that whole picture, then we come back to the question you were posing before, Gerhard, and the question that Ed's pushing us on: what do social scientists have to contribute? Right? So most of the biomimicry people, for example, whether it's circular economy or energy or living in harmony with species and all, they're kind of technical in their orientation. They're ecologists, they're engineers, they're looking at the technical aspects of this. The social sciences should have something to say about what are the nature of the changes in human systems that needs to go hand in hand with this, because I think it's still a perspective that's not well integrated. If you go on just Google biomimicry, I think you'll find fascinating things, because there's wonderful work going on all around the world. But you won't find much as a social scientist. You would say, oh, this really represents very sophisticated thinking about human or social systems. So that's clearly one of the things we'd have to really attend to. But I think to do it without that is just like we're just trying to be experts and show how our expertise works. What I mean without that's why I start with the long term. What's your first principle? Well, human beings have to learn to live in harmony with nature. Great. And there's a lot of work going on that now. What could social scientists contribute?
Okay. Any more questions? Conclusions from our side.
I have one question about the building of the manifesto. Is there a co-creation in a Google Doc document, or how do they collaborate together at the moment?
They might come around to doing something like that. I think you need to kind of go back to, again, Ed got it started, so in some ways his voice is really central. So I would go back to him. I think right now, and I know Ed well enough to think this is kind of consistent with Ed's persona and his natural way of doing things. He wanted to get his view out there, which he did very well. And then he wants to just let a lot of things happen and not try to control or manage it. So my bet is, if you asked Ed, should there be a Google Doc trying to get towards one consensual manifesto, he'd say, nah, not a good idea. Probably. I can't speak for him, but that's my guess. But I also think I can appreciate his point of view. He's saying, don't suppress the diversity. His document gives a point of reference. So whatever you have, you've got his original document. And then maybe eventually there's 3 or 4 others that people write things that are really good. And a lot of people like him. I think Ed would kind of say, in a spirit of self-organizing, see what gets written and see what people find really useful. And don't worry about trying to manage it too tightly, because it's not a process that can be managed very successfully. I'm just guessing, but I mean, that's a good thing to ask him. And what goes with that, of course, is also this Davos type meeting. Is there an event or types of events that if we put our minds together, we think could be catalytic, could have some really big impact? I don't know. I'm always very skeptical of those things. But on the other hand, since Ed put it in his original manifesto, I think we're all asking that question.
Okay. So, dear Peter, thank you very much. Muna or Daniel, would you like to add anything? Any question, remark?
No.
Yes, I was somehow thinking that when you're like comparing the technical stuff, which is good and needed, somehow we concentrate on that instead of concentrating on building our awareness, which is way more difficult for us as humans, because then we have to ask ourselves, why are we here? What's really our aim? Why do I do what I do? Why don't I do what I know I should do, etc.? Which I feel like it's really the tough questions which we try to avoid. So for me, looking out into the world, I see all those tendencies like permaculture, which is just amazing. It's amazing what you can do with it, but somehow it's like little pearls, spread over the world. But then the main motors that activate us are still, or at least we think they are still, the ones that are managing the big money and all these things. And sometimes I think it might just be a question of courage. And as Ed also said, so even if it's like Sisyphus stuff and we just do something and we can start all over again, I think we just need to have the courage to do it anyways. So that's what I hear, because like changing ourselves is so difficult, and we know that. And we need some honesty and courage and just,
I raised a point last night. I couldn't agree with you more, Moon. I think you expressed it very, very well. I raised a point in the email last night that struck me as I looked at all the things. Now, I may have missed a couple because I haven't read every one of the emails, but I've looked at a lot of them. I didn't see anywhere anybody reference the youth climate change movement, the global youth climate change movement, which personally I think is the most important political development in the world. I really do believe that, for the last 2 or 3 decades. Much more important in the larger scheme of things than all the rise of the Trumps of the world. That's what we all pay attention to, of course, because it's so disconcerting to us. But if you look at changes that are pointing in the direction that we need to go, the voice of children and young people, to me, and that's, what you said is what they're saying. Why aren't you doing something? This is my future. This is my life. It's a problem for you, but it's my life. And you're not doing enough because you don't seem to have the courage. You don't seem to have the will, the very points you were making. And of course, they're kids, so maybe they see it in an oversimplified way, but I don't think that's the right way to think of it. I think they see it directly. No bullshit. They don't get hung up on all the technical problems and all the, quote, social system change problems. They just say, this got to happen. So I thought it was very interesting. In the 20 or so people who were chiming in the emails, I didn't see anybody mention that. I think it's a blind spot.
I think so too.
Because
we just forgot to think. We forgot to think in a natural way somehow, right? Yeah.
And they can't see that. And they say, the young people see that.
Yes.
They see just a lot of talk, but you're not really talking about what you need to talk about.
Right. And that's exactly why we were asking you, like, how can we initiate that in let's say in those people who have the power, actually, because we hear that from the youngsters, which is great, but it isn't enough. And we are here, like, we are in a position where we could actually come as experts and tell people, hey, you need to stop.
Well, maybe one question. Yeah, I'm watching the time, so excuse me for being abrupt, but I have a call in a couple of minutes too. We could ask, how could we connect the two? And here's the kind of image that came to my mind as I was listening to what you were just saying, Muna. I have seen a lot of examples where a CEO really became courageous because his daughter talked to him and said, what are you doing? And it moved him, and he heard it at the heart level, not just a head level. And it could very well be that one small task, not small in the sense of easy, but specific, is how to connect the youth climate movement to people in positions of power. Because, if you look at what they're doing, they're using social media and public media, mass media, both. They're trying to kind of become a movement in the world when they have succeeded brilliantly. But, there's no vehicle to get them connected to that Davos summit in a meaningful way. I mean, you could do a token gesture, but I mean, a truly meaningful dialogue. I don't know. It's a question.
Okay.
That's a good task for us to think about it.
Do think about it, yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah, if I can help in any other way, I'm around. Excuse me.
So great. Thanks a lot for really sharing your thoughts with us again.
You're welcome.
And we'll speak again, I hope.
Yes, I'll enjoy it.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye, Peter.
Bye-bye, Peter. Thanks a lot.